Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to break down the language of international trade. And I promise, by the end of our time together, you'll have a solid grasp on the essential rules that decide who's responsible for what when goods cross borders. You'll also see why getting these rules right is absolutely critical.
So let's just start with a really simple question. If you sell something to a customer in another country, when is your responsibility for those goods actually over? Well, the answer might surprise you. For a lot of sellers, their job is completely done, and all the risk transfers over to the buyer the very moment those goods leave the factory. This can happen long before they ever reach their final destination, and sometimes even before the buyer has paid for them.
And that right there leads us to a really common problem. You see, international trade has so many moving parts. If you don't make the responsibilities crystal clear right from the get-go, misunderstandings are almost guaranteed. A tiny bit of confusion can spiral into a really expensive dispute over who has to pay for lost cargo, unexpected fees, or damaged products.
So the goal for us today is to give you that foundational knowledge to make sure those problems don't happen. By the time we're done here, you will have a clear understanding of how to use a special set of rules, they're called Incoterms, to confidently lay out responsibilities, accurately figure out your costs, and really minimize the risk in your own transactions.
To get you there, we've got a clear plan. First, we're going to cover exactly what Incoterms are. Then, second, we'll examine the three core ideas they manage: cost, risk, and delivery. Third, we'll sort all the rules into four simple categories. Fourth, we'll talk about how to actually choose the right rule for your specific shipment. And to wrap it all up, we'll go through some common questions to make sure everything clicks.
Okay, let's start at square one. What exactly are Incoterms?
At their heart, Incoterms are just a set of globally recognized rules for sales between businesses. The easiest way to think of them is like a standardized dictionary for global trade. They're published by the International Chamber of Commerce, or the ICC, and they give both buyers and sellers a single shared language to talk about the key steps in any deal.
Now, understanding what these rules do and what they don't do is absolutely crucial. Incoterms clearly define three main things. First, obligations. That's who does what, like who books the shipping. Second, risk. This is the exact point when the risk of something getting lost or damaged passes from the seller to the buyer. And third, costs. Who pays for which part of the journey? But what they don't define is just as important. Incoterms have nothing to say about who actually owns the goods. That's called transfer of title. They also don't cover payment schedules or what happens if someone breaks the contract. All of that stuff has to be spelled out separately in your sales agreement.
This brings us right to our next point, where we're going to take a closer look at those three core responsibilities that Incoterms are all about.
Let's just zoom in on these three pillars for a moment. Obligations. This covers all the practical tasks. Who's in charge of arranging the main transport? Who handles the paperwork? Risk. This pinpoints that one specific place or moment where the responsibility for any potential loss shifts. And costs. This clearly breaks down which party pays for each part of the process, from shipping and loading fees all the way to insurance. You know, in the world of Incoterms, the word delivery has a very specific legal meaning. It's not what you probably think. It doesn't mean the moment the goods physically arrive at the buyer's warehouse. Instead, delivery is the precise point in the journey where the seller has officially done everything they were required to do. And at that exact moment, the risk of loss or damage to the goods passes from the seller to the buyer. From that point on, it's the buyer's problem.
Now that we have a good feel for those core concepts, let's see how they all fit together. There are 11 Incoterms rules in total, but thankfully they're grouped into four logical categories, which makes them a whole lot easier to wrap your head around. The best way to think about these categories is on a scale, a spectrum of how much responsibility this seller has. On one end, the seller does the absolute minimum. On the other end, the seller is responsible for pretty much the entire journey. And these four categories map out that progression from minimum to maximum perfectly. So let's walk through this table together. The first category, Group E, stands for departure. Here, the risk transfers right at the seller's own building. This is the absolute minimum obligation for the seller. Next up is Group F, for main carriage unpaid. In this case, the risk transfers when the goods are handed over to a shipping company that the buyer chose and is paying for. Now this is different from Group C, for main carriage paid. This is where it gets a little tricky. The seller is the one who pays for the main transport, but, and this is key, the risk still transfers early on, when the goods are handed over to the seller's first carrier. And finally, we have Group D, for arrival. This one's straightforward. The risk doesn't transfer until the goods actually reach the destination country, putting the maximum amount of responsibility on the seller.
Okay, so with all these options, how do you pick the right one? In this section, we're going to focus on the single most important factor in that decision, the mode of transport you're using.
A little bit of history actually helps here. You see, the Incoterms rules aren't set in stone. They've been updated every decade or so since 1936 to keep up with how global trade changes. The very first versions were almost entirely about shipping by sea. But then container shipping exploded, and using a mix of trucks, trains, and ships, what we call multi-modal transport, became the norm. So the rules had to adapt to stay useful. And this evolution brings us to one of the most common mistakes people make in trade today. Why is the term FOB, which means free onboard, so often used incorrectly when shipping containers? The answer is that a lot of people just use it by default, not realizing it was designed for a totally different way of shipping.
So here's the bottom line. FOB is a rule that's only meant for sea or waterway transport. With FOB, the risk transfers when the goods are physically placed on board the ship. But think about it. With modern container shipping, the seller never does that. They hand the big steel box over to a carrier at an inland terminal, often miles away from any port. The correct rule for that situation is FCA, or free carrier. It's designed for any mode of transport, and the risk transfers when the goods are handed to that carrier at a specific named place, like the terminal. This is a perfect example of why you have to match the rule to what's actually happening in the real world. All right, to make sure all of this really sinks in, let's work through a couple of common questions and practical scenarios.
Okay, here's a classic situation. A seller ships goods using the term CIF. That stands for Cost, Insurance, and Freight. But during the journey, the ship sinks. Is the seller required to send a whole new shipment to the buyer?
The answer is no, they don't. And this example really gets to the very core of what Incoterms are about. Under the CIF rule, the seller's job is to get the goods onto the ship and to arrange for insurance. The second those goods are safely on board, the risk of anything happening to them transfers to the buyer. The seller has officially fulfilled their delivery obligation. So while it's a terrible situation, the loss is now the buyer's risk, and that's exactly what the insurance is there to cover.
Let's try one more question to drive home the limits of these rules. What's the single most important legal right that is not covered by any Incoterms rule?
And the answer is the transfer of title, which just means ownership. Incoterms tell you who carries the risk if something goes wrong, but they never, ever say who legally owns the goods at any point. Ownership, along with things like what happens if someone breaks the contract or which country's laws apply, all of that has to be spelled out very clearly in your main sales contract. We have definitely covered a lot of ground, so let's quickly recap the most important takeaways. First, Incoterms are the global rules for defining cost, risk, and obligations. Second, always remember what they don't do. They don't define ownership or payment terms. Third, the 11 rules are much easier to handle when you think of them in their four main groups, E, F, C, and D, which show how much the seller has to do. And finally, the most practical tip of all, always pick the rule that perfectly matches how you're actually shipping your goods. For almost all modern container shipping, that rule is going to be FCA.
And that leaves us with one final thought. As trade becomes more and more digital, a lot of platforms are starting to automate these processes. This raises a really interesting question for the future. How might these digital platforms either increase or maybe decrease the risk of people misusing Incoterms, especially if the rule selection is automated without an expert human checking it? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you found this useful, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing for more content like this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Stay ahead in the world of global commerce. Subscribe to The Ninja for expert analysis. And don't forget to like this video.